The daily cyber briefing for Tuesday, the 16th of July. I'm Stephen Ridgway. So, there's an interesting ransomware group that's exploiting Veeam backup and replication bug. So the exploit has been spotted using CVE 2023-27532, which has a CVSS score of 7.5, so reasonably serious. And it impacts the Veeam backup and replication environment. Basically, an attacker can exploit the vulnerability to obtain encrypted credentials stored in the configuration database, which could potentially lead to them gaining access to the backup infrastructure hosts. So, whilst it is a vulnerability that has been patched a while back, I mean, we're talking about 2023, March 2023, I think that the patch was made available. There is proof of concept exploit code out there, and there is some evidence that the Russian cybercrime group Fin7 has been exploiting the vulnerability since around March, April 2023. There are still vulnerable servers out there, and some of these vulnerable servers are accessible over the internet. So it's very much a recommendation that if you are using Veeam backup and replication, that you ensure that you are being patched. Now, okay, so there's a good write-up, Security Affairs, a good write-up. It shows quite well the steps that the attacker takes, having identified that there is a vulnerable server out there. They're taken from an attack against a Latin American airline, but it is, so it is a good article to have a read of if you want to understand not only this particular vulnerability, but also some of the steps that an attacker will take, which gives you an insight into the sorts of things that you might need to be looking for under other circumstances as well, not just for this particular vulnerability. However, the other side of it, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this today, is it does demonstrate the importance of securing your backups. So one of the few methods available to an organization to recover from ransomware attack is to restore things from known trusted sources. If you've not secured your backups, one of two things will happen. Either the backups themselves will be made unavailable, stolen, deleted, encrypted, or whatever, or vulnerabilities will be baked in to the backups and then re-exploited as soon as the backups are restored. Be aware that happens much more often than people realize. So rebuild the environment from known backups. Backups contain vulnerabilities that the attacker is aware of. As soon as you've rebuilt it all, they hit you again. So that, again, I'm sort of digressing slightly, but that is a good reason why doing some root cause analysis. I was going to say there's some digital forensics, but we're not talking about necessarily going to court here, but doing enough forensic investigation to be able to understand how an attacker gained access and what they did once they were in, because you need to make sure it won't happen again. It is not the easiest part of the incident response life cycle, but it is one of the most important phases or steps in that life cycle. And so if you've been hit by something big, don't hesitate to engage with specialists in the fields if you're struggling to understand what actually happened. It's not easy. I spend a lot of time saying cybersecurity is easy. Well, it is easy, but it's easier than it's made out to be. A lot of that is around it's easier to prevent attacks than people assume. But it is quite hard to unpick what's gone on once you've been attacked. So, make sure you're protecting your backups. Make sure that if you're using backups to restore things, that you're not restoring things that are either corrupted one way or another, or have got vulnerabilities in them, which will then be used to immediately re-exploit you again. So that's kind of the moral of this story. And on the subject of what happens once you've been hit, there is an interesting article in Cybersecurity News. There are always interesting articles, aren't there? Cybersecurity News that I read this morning that is talking about methods of data exfiltration. So it is, I think, fairly well known that data exfiltration is probably the most obvious weak point in most attackers' methodologies. So from their perspective, fortunately, most defenders are not looking. So it's kind of the equivalent.
Here's what I found.
It's kind of the equivalent of a burglar breaking into your house and then sneaking out with your 72-inch TV through the front door whilst your back is turned. You've got to be careful what's going on there. So, right, data exfiltration. Firstly, one of the best ways to stop successful data breaches is to be very strict about what outbound connections can be established. Anything which is going out to the internet really should be going out via a proxy server of some kind, running good quality security software, looking for the sorts of connections that should be blocked. A lot of this stuff is already known, so spotting it if you've deployed the right tools and you've put the right policies in place on the tools, you should be able to stop a lot of this stuff. There are then the slightly more sophisticated things where stuff is tunneled in stuff. Some of those things, those things can be spotted. You just need to be a little bit more on top of what's actually going on. And then you get to the really quite difficult to spot unless you've thought of it and you've done something. And exfiltrating via DNS is one of those. DNS queries is one of those things. DNS queries go on all the time. You'd be surprised the number of organizations that effectively have a kind of unfettered chain out to DNS servers on the internet without any kind of filtering or, frankly, mostly no monitoring of what's going on. Now, if you are using, to get around a lot of this stuff, Firstly, good outbound controls, really, really important. This concept of if you're inside, you must be okay, so you will allow all outbound connections, is very foolish. Should be logging and monitoring your DNS requests, and you should have alerting on unusual or otherwise known malicious lookups for unusual and known malicious DNS names. Also, this is a very good reason why looking into network intrusion detection is really important. The number of times we've come across organizations who argue, well, we don't really need it, we don't have enough of a network, it doesn't really matter, what are we trying to protect? Firstly, yes, you do have a network, you may not run it, but there is a network there. Think about it, you couldn't connect to it otherwise. Okay, so having visibility of what's going on that network is really important. It's especially important if you don't actually even own that network. It's provided for you by data center provider, cloud provider, whatever it might be. So network intrusion detection is really important and will catch a lot of this sort of stuff. Logging and monitoring DNS lookups, partly because connections are often made via DNS is actually used by attackers because if you hard code IP addresses into things, it is relatively simple to black hole the IP address. So you need to have some flexibility around where you're trying to exfiltrate to. Well, the easiest way to do that is to use DNS. So logging and monitoring DNS and having alerting on DNS is very important. And then you kind of get onto the, it can get really, really clever. And there's the article from Cybersecurity News talks about a actually really clever method of DNS data exfiltration. And it's known as data bouncing. So under certain circumstances, it's possible to use trusted web hosts to facilitate DNS resolution. So an example, hackers send an HTTP request to a reputable domain like bbc.co.uk with a forged host header containing the attacker's domain. Certain HTTP servers, Akamai Ghost HTTP servers, for example, are configured to resolve those names and process the request. Which is basically then going to unwittingly aid the exfiltration. The concept here is that the hosts field, it's in all HTTP requests, and it specifies the requested domain. The reason for this being that originally one web server hosted one domain on one IP address, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, scaled really, really badly. So very quickly, the concept of proxying multiple web servers off one externally facing IP address came up, be that on multiple servers or actually on the same server, but hosting multiple websites. So the concept of host headers is how does your web server work out which domain it is supposed to be, which website is supposed to be serving. So this is a means of tricking a web server into doing the DNS resolution for you. So if you send a request to, say, bbc.co.uk header for attackerdomain.com, the trusted domain server, trusted web server, carries out the DNS resolution for you. Very clever. I think the whole thing that is particularly clever. Worth having a read of this article and having a think about it, because then it does look like one of the things that should be in your detection toolkit is some alerting around mysterious host header information. So not just the hosting web server itself, but what the host header is saying is the website that is being requested off that server, because that gets round a whole load of protections that you would otherwise build into DNS within your own organization, because the DNS query is being done elsewhere. Very clever, very interesting, worth thinking about. Not impossible to detect once you know about it. Not impossible to detect by any manner of means, but equally something that is likely to get missed unless you're thinking about it. All right, and then quickly, a couple of other quick updates. Kaspersky is exiting the US market after the e-commerce department, following the Commerce Department ban. So if you are a US user of Kaspersky, strongly recommend that you look for alternatives before they actually exit. Don't know what's happening with support for it's very polleny today, horrible. But don't know what's happening with support for existing contracts with Kaspersky in the US, probably all terminating. And just a very quick reminder, Paris Olympics is coming up. Expect nastiness. So that's all from me for today. So I hope you have a good